Thank you. Okay, so I think that Tim really explained well what I do. I come from a perspective of global history, and also from the study of the so-called esoteric traditions or Western esotericism. And in my specific PhD project, I treat two spheres of ideas within Theosophy, and these are international ideas, such as universal brotherhood, which I argue is a cosmopolitan position, and universal history perspectives. Both are prominent perspectives throughout the 19th century. And my project is really about contextualizing Theosophy within these two spheres of ideas, so to speak. I will start to outline the presentation. Really, I have two arguments. The first one is that Blavatsky contributed to the international debate of the 19th century. She defined a radical cosmopolitan perspective, something she called an international society, international in the highest sense. This society, universal brotherhood, was particularly critical of the concept of nationalism, the nation state and nationality, and also, as Karl Bayer explained, the West itself. From the outset of this presentation of Blavatsky and her concept of universal brotherhood, I want to problematize the notion of Western esotericism, particularly from a global history perspective, more as a kind of a top label for the study of esotericism. I will argue, on the other hand, that also neglecting this Western perspective or notion of the West within Theosophy is also problematic. But let's just jump straight into it. I will start with an example from the Key to Theosophy. And I have chosen this example because the Key to Theosophy was a relatively late publication of Blavatsky, and it thus exhibits her ideas relatively late in her life. And we can assume that her ideas didn't change that much from this point on. But as most of you might know, this book is constructed in a way so it's formed in kind of a dialogue between the master, which was Blavatsky, and then apprentice, which asked her questions. And in this particular case, Blavatsky is asked whether the Theosophical Society is a political organization. And Blavatsky answers that it is certainly not. It is international in the highest sense, in that its members comprise men and women of all race, creeds, and forms of thought who work together for one object, the improvement of humanity. And she also adds that it takes no part in national or party politics. So what is going on here? To understand this, I really think that we need to make what I call an intermezzo, a contextualizing intermezzo. We need to talk about what internationalism meant in the 19th century. Turning to the origin of the concept, it was Jeremy Bentham who coined the phrase international law in the late 18th century. And as an utilitarist, Bentham was relatively open to this international law being either dominated by national ideas or a more cosmopolitan stance. So we have a concept of internationalism not really fixed in the way we know it today as a system of nation states. If you look at what kind of ideas which was related to internationalism in the 19th century, we can, for instance, point out that Mazzini also formulated an idea of internationalism. This was based on the nation, nationality, and the nation state as a point of departure. As some of you might know, Blavatsky was quite familiar with Mazzini, and as Paul Johnson has argued in his The Masters Revealed, Blavatsky and the early Theosophical Society very much debated Mazzini and his ideas. The 19th century also saw the emergence of Karl Marx and his conception of internationalism, rather than based on the nation. This was an idea of a cosmopolitan society, or at least he hoped to reach the stage of a cosmopolitan society at one point, which was socially based on a class constructions, so to speak. And as some of you might also know, Blavatsky took quite a thorough stance against socialist and communist ideas. So we have here the outlines of the debate of internationalism in the 19th century, in which concepts such as cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and class were central. Now, I would like to turn back to Blavatsky. And I want to underline the kind of ideas she brought into this debate. Because what did she really mean by international in the highest sense? It is my argument that she was defining what I call theosophical internationalism. While many often, and perhaps primarily, associate Blavatsky with esoteric ideas, I believe that one of the contexts we can place her in is exactly this international context. If we remember back to yesterday, we had Paulina asking a question, what other perspectives we can use to understand Blavatsky besides esoteric ideas? And this is my suggestion that this could be one. Because as all the other players within the debate, that is Mazzini and Marx, she debated cosmopolitanism, nationalism, class, and politics. She addressed this as a universal brotherhood, and I will show shortly that she used just such concepts as cosmopolitanism and nationalism within this debate. Firstly, here I have an example from Lucifer from 1888, and here she really attached this idea of a theosophist and a cosmopolitan to each other. As she states, first of all, poor is the theosophical culture which fails to transform simply a good citizen of his native country into a good citizen of the world. A true theosophist must be cosmopolitan in his heart. So the idea of cosmopolitanism was definitely there within the Theosophical Society, specifically in Blavatsky's writings. Next, we also have the idea of national antipathies. As you can see here, she argues that the Theosophical Society will break down racial and national antipathy and barriers and will open the way to the practical realization of the brotherhood of all men, or universal brotherhood. In this quote, we also have the idea of the West, as Karl Bayer argued, as a negative other compared to the East. So what is with this connection to global history? As I said at the beginning, I come from the perspective of global history. And here I have really encountered some significant problems with researching the Theosophical Society from the outset of Western esotericism. And this has mainly to do with what Sebastian Conrad, a global historian, has argued to be the birth defects of modern social sciences and humanity. And these are, first of all, mythological nationalism and Eurocentrism. He argues that the promise of global history is a perspective that aims beyond what he called the spatial containers and narrative of Eurocentrism. Thus, a perspective that aims beyond the spatial containers of nationalism and the nation as well. Instead, it aims for a global departure and a focus on what some have defined as connections or entanglement. He also adds that global history has a polemical dimension to it, as it constitutes the assault on many forms of container-based categories. But why study theosophy and global history together? It is my argument that theosophy very much fulfills what Conrad defines as the promise of global history. If we look at the Theosophical Society, and the idea of universal brotherhood, we really find that idea of humanity is connected on a global scale. We also find the idea that we need to break down national borders and identities, and we find an outspoken critique against Europe and Western ideas at last, such as science, history, philosophy, politics, and, as I have just shown, international ideas. So in a way, global history's focus on global connections, anti-national and anti-Eurocentric perspectives is very much embedded in the idea of universal brotherhood. But what about Western esotericism? It is my argument that Western esotericism was very much construed as one of these container-based paradigms from the outset. As some of you might know, the birth of Western esotericism as an academic field was set into the world by Anton Favour. His quest, so to speak, was to remove academic distrust from the academic field of esotericism. How he did that was to define it within a Western time and space, which was Europe and Florence and the Renaissance period. Naturally, this container-based paradigm was problematic from scholars with a more global or universal outlook. Early voices against it was, for instance, Kogo von Stuckrad, who offered a model focusing on what he called claims of higher knowledge and ways of accessing these. Arthur West Lewis has also offered a model with a more universal approach, who argues for gnosis and a focus on gnosis instead of geographical boundaries. So if we look at Western esotericism, or the study of esotericism on the one hand, and global history on the other, there really are significant similarities. First of all, both fields emerged in the 1990s as methodological disciplines. Secondly, both in one way or the other was engaged in the question of the West, or Eurocentrism. Within the field of Western esotericism, we have scholars defining a more universal approach against a more Eurocentric approach. Within global history, we have a whole field emerging against titles such as the West and the Rest and how the West won. Both fields also contains a polemical discourse against Eurocentric position. Both fields also exhibits unclarity in the sense that there's not really a consensus on what place the West as both a category, a geographical entity, and a concept needs to play. So, turning to some of the problems I have faced and really not solved at this very moment. From the perspective of global history, Western esotericism, with the point of departure in the West as a geographical entity, is quite problematic. Why is it problematic? Because global history promised to negate this outset and perspective altogether in favor of a more global-oriented approach. But two, the second problem, which also problematizes the first, is that if global history, as Conrad argued, is a polemical discourse, a position directed against Eurocentric narrative and container-based categories such as the West, it really is dependent on these to function. For instance, imagine Blavatsky without her great antagonist of the West and related ideas such as politics, class, and nationalism. To try to go beyond this, I will turn to David Washbrook and an article he wrote in 2013, which really has to do with how do we deal with the West in global history. As he argued back then, to leave out the West as a concept altogether in global history, particularly after the 16th century, is virtually impossible from a global history perspective. From here on then, Europe played an ever more increasingly role in an entangled global network of connections. Neglecting Europe, as some scholars within global history has chosen to do in favor of South-to-South contact, is not a position he wants to emphasize either as global history. It has its merit, but it's not global history. Rather, he argued that Europe should not be the center or point of departure, but it should not be left out altogether. He argued that Europe is something to be discussed and debated, and what global history really needed to do was put the West in its place. So, in honor of the late David Rosbrook, I would like to reflect on why I study Theosophy and Esotericism from a global perspective. And what can we conclude? Global history, when you look at Esotericism, is not to forget the West altogether, I would argue. Maybe it's a way to problematicize such notions, just as Blavatsky did. Western esotericism, from this perspective, is problematic, I would argue, as a top label of studying traditions such as, for instance, Theosophy. Exactly because it problematizes a global approach to the study of Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. But on the other hand, some esoteric groups did really emphasize the West within the Theosophical Society, such as Blavatsky. They emphasized a national, anti-national discourse and the anti-Western perspective, which is really the perspective that global history aims to emphasize. So if we leave the notion of West altogether, there are a chance that we will miss such fine details. Neglecting the West is, I would argue, neglecting a part of our global history that really sought to understand the West place in a more global world. And if we look at Blavatsky's universal brotherhood idea, this is exactly what he sought to do. And with this, I will conclude my presentation, and the floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much, Bjarke, for this presentation, which connects directly with the theme of the conference here on globalism and interconnections. And so, as Bjarke said, the floor is open for questions. So please raise your hand or write in the comment field. But while you consider your questions, Bjarke, maybe you will allow me to start by asking you a question. So if I understand you correctly, you're basically arguing that if we want to study esoteric traditions or phenomena like the Theosophical Society, we actually to some extent also need the category of the West, even though it's a very global society. Is that basically what you're arguing? Or? Yeah,
that's the baseline. As I also said, I haven't really found the final solution, and I don't really think that maybe we can do that. But the outset is that this top label of Western esotericism, I think, is really problematic when you study Theosophy. And if you place Theosophy under that heading of Western esotericism, a global history perspective is quite problematic. Yeah.
So in many ways, this connects with what Karl Bayer also talked about, that within the philosophical viewpoint, there is a critique of certain central elements of the so-called West.
Yeah.
In a way,
and these are, for instance, national ideas. To take just one example.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Bjarke? In that case, maybe I think Tony, you have something? I can see Erica, maybe you can unmute Tony. Or...
Yes, I am muted. Well,
Hello.
hello.
Hi, Bjarke.
When you had an illustration, and I think it had the second object on it, a rather nice illustration.
Yes. Do you want
Yeah.
me to show it again? Do you want me to find the illustration again?
If it's quick, but otherwise, I'll just yes, that's it. So it's partly a comment, but and I don't know that it helps in what you're saying, but a lot of the theosophical literature and stuff got changed after the death of H.P. Blavatsky.
Mm-hmm.
So the second object in 1890, before she died in 1891, it says it's to promote the study of Aryan and other Eastern literatures, religions, philosophies, and sciences, and to demonstrate their importance to humanity.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to me to be saying what the second object in the illustration is saying and what it has now become.
I'm more referring to the first.
Sorry, I thought you were doing that. With the first one, is it the main difference is to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
And you might see a difference in that or not, because in the sense there's only one nucleus.
Yeah. Oh. So what was, I don't think I really understood the question. What was the question?
Well, because I was looking at the second object and not first, it was the fact that it's not saying about Western in that, it's saying about the Eastern.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Of the Aryan and Eastern.
Yeah. But what I have wanted to emphasize was really, I took my point of departure in the first point, which is to form the nucleus of universal brotherhood. And if you look at that category of universal brotherhood, it is really much connected to a critique of the West at large, and its ideas, such as international ideas, as Mazzini and Marx proposed them.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Possibly. I think it does. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry to get the wrong end of the stick at that bit. Yes.
Thank you, Tony, for your. I think it was more of a comment really than a question. And thank you, Bjarke, for your answer. I think it's important to look at the wording actually of some of this material, because as I think, Bjarke, you know as well that these formulations changed over time, and a different emphasis of the words and so forth, which is important to be aware of course.
Yeah.
But I think we have another question in the comment from Joyce. I think, what is the source of the diagram or the picture you just showed with the three objects of the Theosophical Society? Do you know what the source is for this?
Oh no, but I can find it. I don't.
I can tell you, it's from the Theosophical Society in America.
Yeah.
They were giving they created it. There is another question, Tim, on the chat.
So there's one from Marlin. I'm curious about your thoughts about how the concept of internationalism changed over time within the TS, for example, in relation to the development of the League of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
I find a lot of questions about this within the Swedish Theosophical Journal.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, and that is my next chapter, and I'm working on collecting the sources and material for that at the moment. This lecture or this presentation was really based on a preliminary finding for my first and second chapter, which is trying to establish that context of internationalism while Blavatsky was alive, and how Blavatsky thought it would define the concept initially, and now I will turn to how that concept changed and developed into the 20th century, along other ideas such as exactly the League of Nations and later FN as well. But let's see how that goes in the future. But for the meantime, I really want to emphasize that her form of internationalism, at least there in the 1890s, was really had this universal sense to it, and she distanced it from internationalism based on either nationalism or class. So there was that foundation from the outset, and that perhaps changed. I don't know about it yet, but maybe next year we'll have some findings on that.
I think we have a few in the comments fields, and then we have Tony.
Yes, we have some questions on the chat, and Tony, I will unmute you so you can conclude your question, and then we have few comments on the chat.
Just by the way, thanks very much for your talks. I think it was marvelous. So that thing. But with the first object form of universal brotherhood, perhaps it was meant more in the sense that Plato meant it, that it's of the universal rather than the particulars, but it's more of a spiritual thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned this particularness, Plato perspective, because she actually emphasizes that distinctions between the general and the particular, with the general being the universal. And I think that you are quite right that this was the conception she put behind her definition of universal brotherhood, at least to some extent.
Thank you again for your comment, Tony, and Bjarke for answering. So we have a few comments here. I think more and more of the nature of comments than questions. Thank you, Bjarke. It helps to put philosophy in perspective. Also from Marina, we have great talk. It's interesting to think about HPP's own position between East and West as someone from Russia who were sometimes perceived as Oriental in the West.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good.
From Janet, yes, it's worth looking at how and why the objects changed over the first years of the TS. And I think that relates also to what Tony said, that maybe it's not necessarily just about the political aspect, but also a spiritual aspect to the notion of universal brotherhood. And Paul says someone like Hudson would depict HPP's explicit universalism as a tool of implicit Eurasianism, which advanced Russian interests in India, making anti-West sentiment anti-British, but not anti-Russian. So some entanglement there as well. More comments. I really think that Eastern esotericism and spirituality gives us much more tools to understand Western esotericism and spirituality than the opposite. And Paulina, maybe this is for a different discussion that was on the chat previously.
I actually also things that one of the questions Paulina again asked yesterday is, why did people join the Theosophical Society? That you can see that when Blavatsky changed to this universal brotherhood international idea, a lot of her colleagues really complained because they were more interested in these esoteric occult ideas. And when they changed that, the focus of the Theosophical Society to universal brotherhood as a primary object in the early 80s, we have people really rejecting this approach to Theosophy, because they really wanted Theosophy to be about esoteric philosophies and such ideas. But that is another niche to be looked into as well.
Definitely. So we have some more comments about it might be a good idea to look further into the changes in the objects, and Eric has written about this as well, and Bjarke also talks about this in the comments. But I think we have to end this round now, and then now there will be a break until past, and then we will be back for our